Hi everyone and welcome to the channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at getting an AT system and putting it into an ATX case. And for this video we're going to be using this system. It's my sort of everyday use late MS-DOS, Windows 3.1, early Windows 95 sort of system. If you've watched the channel before you might have seen this crop up in one or two videos. Now in here we've got a motherboard with an Intel FX chipset and a classic Pentium 133 MHz chip, so yeah, quite late for an AT system, but that's the sort of vintage that we're going to be dealing with. But why might you want to take an AT system like that and put it into an ATX case? Well, I think the main reason here in the UK certainly is that there's just not many AT cases about, and there's certainly a lot more choice in sort of old beige ATX cases than there is AT cases. And the few AT cases that do come up, more often than not, are in really bad nick. They look like they've been dragged through edge backwards or something. So yeah, and unless you want to do a sort of full restoration on them, they weren't really a sort of appealing proposition for me. So yeah, just general availability of cases is probably the main reason. Now my reasonings for this particular one are slightly different. I mean, as you can see here, we've got a desktop style case where you stick your CRT on top. The only problem with that is with a good size CRT, the top of the screen is sort of quite high up there somewhere, and it's just annoying to be sort of tilting your head back all the time to sort of use the CRT. And no, I'm not messing about with chairs and changing the desk and all that kind of stuff, so I wanted to take this and put it into a tower format AT system. But I ran into that problem that I've just described, where I spent a good few months looking and just couldn't find an AT tower case that was in good condition. So I ended up thinking, okay, get an ATX tower case, loads of them to choose from, and it'll make a nice video to show what we need to do, to do that. However, what I then found was there's a seller on eBay, I think it was, and they were selling a tower ATX case, beige, new old stock, that kind of thing, that they reckon to have already prepared for you to take an AT system and just drop it straight into the case. So I thought, great, that's that's the problem solved. So I thought we'd get one of them and we'll take a look at it. And here it is. So just to be clear before we start, I haven't been given this, I haven't been asked to review it, or I haven't got a discount or any of that stuff. I've bought this with my own money, just like anybody else would, so totally free to give me sort of full, honest opinions about this thing. So give us a second, I'll get it out of the box and we'll take a look. First impressions, not a fan of this sort of blue plasticky bit of trim round here. That to me screams late or later on sort of ATX cases. You know, the time when we were sort of heading towards Windows XP and all the cases started having bits of kind of translucent plastic on the front. Yeah, this to me is very similar to that. It certainly doesn't look fitting for sort of an AT type system replacement thing. Yeah, let's not worry about that today because that's not really the focus of today's video, but I can see this thing having a meeting with a can of spray paint in the not too distant future. But yeah, other than that, it's an ATX case. As I say, it's new old stock, so it's clean, it's in really good condition. It's sort of, there's no dents or scratches or anything like that. Notice we've got a couple of little pull tabs at the back for removing the side panel rather than screw, so that's quite a nice little touch. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 5¼ inch bays and 2 3½ inch bays, or external ones anyway, so that's nice, since obviously cases nowadays hardly have any of them, if at all, but back then it wasn't uncommon to sort of pack a few devices into these. Little sort of flappy bit on the front. There's front audio ports and front USB ports in there, which probably not going to use a lot on a system like this, but nice to have, I guess, nonetheless. But yeah, other than that, it's a sort of fairly cheap looking, generic looking ATX case, but it should do us for what we need. So before we get inside this thing, let's jump back to the other system and take a look at the sort of areas, or the things if you like, that stop us just taking an AT motherboard and plonking it straight into an ATX case. Let's have a look at the problem areas that could crop up. Right, we're back with the AT system, and in order to put this into the ATX case, there's sort of three main areas that we just got to sort of be aware of. Now the first of these is the power supply. Now the way an AT power supply switches on and off is different to the way an ATX power supply does. On an AT unit, you've got your mains voltage coming into the back, and that effectively goes straight through the power supply, and on this one, down this black cable here, and it comes to the power switch on the front of your case. So that means you've got full mains voltage on the back of that switch, and that could be, you know, sort of typically anything from about 100 to 110 volts up to about 230 volts, depending on where you are in the world. And that's why power switches on AT cases tend to kind of sound bigger and chunkier. You know, because they are. They have to be rated to, you know, to carry that full mains voltage. And this is a physical switch here. When it's closed, power supply, and therefore the computer on, and when it's open, it's off. So there's no way for the operating system via the motherboard to tell that power supply to switch on and off. It can only be done by the switch. And that's why on, you think back to sort of Windows 95, that sort of era of operating systems, when you were running it on an AT system, you'd get that message at the end, it's now safe to turn off your computer. And that's because, you know, there's no means for the computer to tell the power supply to turn itself off. Now on an ATX power supply, the mains voltage comes in the back, stays entirely inside the power supply unit. You just have a low voltage cable coming to the power switch, and it's just a little momentary switch. So obviously the switches can be a lot smaller, and it's a lot safer done that way. And as I say, it's momentary, so a little contact turns it on, but the switch doesn't stay closed. It's not a kind of physical on-off switch for the power supply. And what that means is, with an ATX motherboard and a compatible operating system, your computer can kind of turn itself on if you like. You know, when it can wake up, you know, to a LAN event, wake up on ring of a modem, etc. Or it can turn itself off, and you know, when you went to an ATX system, you didn't have that. You can now, you know, it's now safe to turn off your computer message. There were a couple of other things to do with sort of power and sleep modes and all that kind of stuff that you had to have to get that working, but generally that was the main difference. Now the long and short of all this is that when we take this system and put it in the ATX case, the AT power supply, that won't come across. The AT power supply will stay in the AT case, and we'll use an ATX power supply in the ATX case. You know, you're not going to mix power supply and case type. They tend to stay together. One other minor thing with the power supply, the AT plug, that's the main power connector into the motherboard, that's different on an AT system compared to an ATX system. Now we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail in a minute, but the long and short of it is you're going to need some sort of adapter to let you plug an ATX power supply, main sort of motherboard plug, into an AT motherboard. Okay, quick pause while I add a bit more information into the video. Most ATX power supplies do not have a -5 volt rail. It's something that was taken out of the ATX spec quite early on. A few of the very early ATX power supplies still had it, and all the AT power supplies had it. Now, for most people, that's not going to be a problem, but there are a small amount of ISA expansion cards that need that -5 volt connection. There are a few sound cards, I think, and a couple of modem cards or something like that, but if you've got one of those cards that needs it, you're probably already aware of this. For the vast majority of people, it's not going to be a problem, but just thought it was worth mentioning just so everybody was aware of it. Right. Back to the video. Now the second thing that we need to be aware of is all to do with kind of plugging things in and out of the motherboard and the computer. Let me explain. So we'll start with the I/O port. So I'm talking serial port, parallel port, a game port, that kind of thing. Now on an early AT system, the sort of capabilities for those were normally found on an expansion card. So you'd have an expansion card, you know, in one of your ISO slots or whatever, and you'd have your ports, maybe a serial port, a parallel port, built into the back of that card. You know, plug your stuff in the back, no problem. Now on later AT systems like this, the capabilities for those started getting built into the motherboard. And so you'd have headers for those ports on the motherboard, and then you'd have your ribbon cable to connect from the header to the back of the case somehow. Now I've got my ports installed on this case with these little sort of port blanks. You knock the middle out the blank and then attach the port in using the retaining screws for the little twiddly screws on the end of the cable when you're plugging a cable in. You can get them out that way, or you could mount these to a sort of slot cover that's got the same cutouts in, and so they'd appear down here where your slots are, or up here where they are, whichever. Now, not all ATX cases are going to have the little blanks put in for you to get these ports out the case. So in this example here that I've got, I'd have to find an ATX case that's got these in, or if not, I'd have to get some slot covers that have already got the cutouts in for these. Now, you might not be able to get those, or you might want all your slots already taken up with expansion cards, so you're going to have a little bit of thinking about what to do if you haven't got an easy means to get your serial ports and your parallel port, etc. out the back of the case. Now, in a similar vein to that, just briefly on front panel buttons and connectors, on an AT system, you've normally got a turbo button on there. And you'll have an associated lead, you know, one of your front panel connector leads that'll plug into the turbo header on your motherboard. Now, I haven't got one on this motherboard, but again, on the earlier sort of stuff, there's a good chance that you have. It's very, very, very unlikely you'll find an ATX case with a turbo button on, and even rarer perhaps to find one with the little sort of 7-segment type display showing the clock speed, you know, as you toggled between them from pressing your turbo button. So the 7-segment display, you're almost certainly going to have to live without that. Your turbo button, you've got options there. You could, perhaps have a button inside the case, just a little switch. You could leave the little front panel header either open or closed with a jumper, depending on what state you want that in. Neither of those are great, because it means if you do want to change it, you've got to start messing about inside your case. Another option might be to perhaps bring a little discrete toggle switch, maybe out the back of the case somewhere, to change that the state of the turbo. But again, it's just something that if the turbo button or that speed display is important to you, it's something you need to be aware of. Okay, final thing on connectivity, and just before we do, these are the little sort of port blanks that I was just talking about. You can see here where I've got the serial and parallel ports installed to them. But yeah, final thing, keyboards. Now, AT keyboard connector, it's the big sort of chunky 5-pin DIN plug. Hole in the AT case, plug the keyboard straight in. So it was about the only port that was sort of naturally built into the motherboard. Now, when we put this board in an ATX case, it almost certainly won't sort of normally have a sort of big hole cut out just there for the keyboard plug. On ATX, of course, you've got the little sort of I/O shield and the big rectangular cutout, and you know, all this kind of inbuilt stuff comes out there, and you have to use the shield that matches your motherboard. Now, we may get lucky and we may find out that that hole is sort of in line with the I/O shield, but until we actually get the board mounted in the case, again, we're not going to know exactly how all that lines up. So yeah, just something to be aware of. Again, you've got to make sure that your keyboard connector is lined up with some sort of hole in the case so you can plug your keyboard in. Okay, third thing, motherboard mounting. Now, you know what it's like on an ATX case. You've got your holes in your motherboard and you've got the little brass standoffs. You put the motherboard in and screw through each hole into each of the little standoffs, holds the motherboard down. AT motherboards, similar kind of story, but not quite the same. For starters, the mounting holes, not all of them are common between AT and ATX. Some are, there's a couple that aren't. You can usually find enough that are common between both in order to hold the motherboard down securely. There were some early ATX cases that when you looked on the little motherboard mounting tray, you would see it had the holes in for both types of motherboards. But again, the kind of newer your ATX case, the less likely it is to find that. And I don't think you'd find any new ones these days with that in. The actual mounting itself, back on AT motherboards, you normally only used a couple of the mounting holes with those brass standoffs. You can see here, instead, for most of the holes, you have these little sort of plastic clips, sort of peg type things. Used to go in on these little kind of slidey runners. You'd slide the plastic peg in, and then when you drop the motherboard over it, the top kind of expands out. These two little arms come out, and it holds the motherboard in place. And then to get it back out, you've got to kind of squeeze those little arms together and pull it through from the reverse. You can still use those mounting holes on a little brass standoff with a screw through them. You've just got to make sure you've got enough of those holes that line up to get enough screws in to make sure your motherboard's held securely. Right then, now that we know there's sort of three areas that we need to be aware of, I'll get all these parts taken out of here and we'll come back with the ATX case. We'll start building the system in, and then we'll see what's been done by the seller and also what else is left to do, you know, for us to sort of fix any problems that come up and get this installed in its new home. Okay, let's take this side off and see what we've got. Okay, so first up we've got the cooling fan on this green bracket that's a bit in the way. That should just bend up there, but it is screwed into the back of the case here, so we can take that out of the way if need be. Right, power. We have a power supply in with a couple of SATA power cables, but a reasonable number of Molex connectors. Just the one 4-pin floppy drive connector. It's made by 7 Team. Never heard of them. It's 150 watt maximum on 3.3 and 5 volts, and there's two 12 volt rails, 15 watt each. Total wattage on that is 330 watts. Would it do 330 watts? What kind of quality is that power supply? Absolutely no idea. Power wise, it would be ample for this kind of vintage system that we're going to put in here. Quality wise, you know, that's only sort of a question that you can answer for yourself, you know, whether or not you want to use a kind of slightly unknown sort of brand like this for your system, or whether you wanted to go with something else. That would be, you know, a decision that only you can make for your stuff. But also in here we've got the main power cable. You can see we've already got an adapter on to take it from the ATX to the AT plugs, and we've also got this connection out to the front switch of the case for turning it on and off, because obviously we don't have that connected to the motherboard. We've got a bag with a 3-pin lead in and a I/O shield for the back. We'll have a look at that in a minute. Usual box of bits in there, no doubt, and then just our normal things for, you know, power LED, hard disk LED, and so on. Cable for the front USB ports, so if you have got a late AT system with some early USB, you could use that if you wanted. We've also got this cable coming through the case. Now this is for the front audio ports, and it just loops out the back of one of the blank slot covers here. You can see we've got a couple of 3.5mm jacks for plugging into the sound card. So if you did, for example, want to bring any of those ports to the front, you could do that using this cable and use the front ports. Just be a bit easier than going around the back of the computer, so that's quite a nice touch. Just looking at the mounting holes on the motherboard plate. Now, none of them are marked up, which is a bit of a shame. These that are sort of built into these kind of raised dimples on the tray, they're ATX mounting holes, but you can see we've got a lot of other holes that I would imagine you could put standoffs in. So yeah, that's quite good to see. I think there's a good chance there that our mounting holes are going to line up. Again, would be nice if each hole was kind of marked to just say whether it's AT or ATX, but yeah, well, let's see when we get the motherboard in, but that certainly looks quite promising. So in this bag, other than the power cable, looks a decent length. That just a standard 3-pin, three-prong plug kettle lead thing. We've also got this. It's a ATX sort of cut-out motherboard shield, but you can see we've got the single big hole in it for the AT keyboard connector. So we remember to stick that in there. That should, fingers crossed, that should line up quite nicely. Also in here, we've got 4 thick rubber blocks and 4 screws. Now what on earth are they for? So there's a close-up of them. I think what they're actually intending with these is if you have some motherboard mounting holes that don't line up with a hole in there, I think what they're intending you to do is to stick one of these where the hole is, or would be, on the motherboard tray, and you screw one of these screws through the hole and it kind of bites into this rubber block. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So long as you weren't solely holding your motherboard on using these, I don't think there's any chance of it kind of falling out or anything like that. I mean, I wouldn't trust just these. You want to be on a couple of not normal mounts as well. And when you plug in expansion cards in and whatnot, the fact that you've got something under that, under each portion of the motherboard will stop it wanting to bend down and stop it flexing too much. It's a good thing from that point of view. Yeah. I mean, it's nice in the fact as well that it can cover, I guess, a mounting hole in pretty much any position. So yeah, never seen that kind of thing before, but I hope we don't need it, but if we do, that might just, get us out of a bind for the odd sort of mounting hole that isn't covered. And then in the cardboard box, we've got a bag of screws and standoffs, all good to see. Oh, we've got some instructions as well. Yeah, some not very useful information about how to install a expansion card and whatnot. But yeah, probably don't need that bit. But good that the usual bag of bits is included. So coming round to the back of the case, I think if we are going to have a sort of problem area, I think this is going to be it. And you remember when we were just talking about getting the built-in serial ports, parallel ports, etc. out the back of the case? Well, here we've got no ports, sort of knockouts for ports stamped into the back of the case. We've just got this currently empty mounting area for an 80mm fan, and obviously all we've got on this blanking plate, which is going to be up here, is the cutout for the AT keyboard connector. So we are in that sort of slightly tricky area where, where are we going to put the serial ports and the parallel ports? I don't think I've got any port sort of covers with those ports built in, with a ribbon cable sort of on the back to plug into the motherboard. So yeah, that's going to be a tricky one. But I think if everything sort of fits how I think it will, I think I might have a solution for it. It's just something to bear in mind with this kind of kit. If you've got a case without the knockouts in, as we've said, even if you get one of these and whatnot as well, if you don't bring the ports out down here somewhere, then you're going to be a little bit stuck if you want to use those ports and you want them out the back of the computer. Okay, so ports, we think that might be a little bit tricky, but I think we've got a way around that. Power supply, that's already been converted for us as part of the kit, so I think we're going to be fine there. And likewise on motherboard mounting, we've got plenty of options, so I think that'll be all right. And obviously we've got those little rubber block things if we need to kind of fall back and use that. But the only way we're going to know if we need to do that is by getting the system built. So let's crack on and get some parts in here. So there we go, we've got our system installed, but how was it against our sort of 3 potential problem areas? Well, first up, power supply. I mean, yeah, that was a piece of cake at the end of the day. It's just plugging in a couple of cables. The adapter harness was already installed, as we saw, so yeah, no worries there. Just plugging cables in, everything else on this is pre-done. So that was nice. I mean, that would be pretty much identical either using this kit or whether you bought one of these sort of adapter harnesses to change your own, ATX case into an AT one. The only thing being you'd have to take these 2 wires and connect them to the to the front switch. So yeah, no worries there. That bit was all good. Second area, and the ports, getting the serial and parallel ports, or maybe a game port as well if you've got one out the back. As you may have seen in the build, I've resorted to sort of 3D printing this ATX style motherboard backplate, and yeah, that's worked really well. I've mounted 2 serial ports and the parallel port in that, and obviously I already had the cutout for the keyboard port. Now, since I didn't have any ports that were built into into slot covers, or if you don't want to use all those because you want to whack a load of expansion cards in, since there were no other cutouts in the case, that was the only option. It was a fairly simple part to design and 3D print. All the dimensions for the ports and the dimensions of the ATX cutout, they're easy to find online. So if you're sort of new to 3D printing, that might be sort of quite a nice little project for you to try. There's just one thing to bear in mind with it, because there is no motherboard or anything behind these ports. I've deliberately made this quite a tight fit, but if you were really ham-fisted sort of plugging these cables in, you might just kind of pop that out backwards. So all I've done on the inside is put a little dab of hot glue in these corners just to make sure that it doesn't push back in. But other than that, it works essentially exactly the same as an ATX one does. In terms of this kit, I do think it's a shame that they didn't put some cutouts into this sort of pre-supplied blank. If you're in this sort of situation like me, that would have really kind of helped anybody who doesn't have a 3D printer, or perhaps didn't want to design something like this. So yeah, a little bit of a missed opportunity there, I think, with regards to this particular kit. Right, moving on to our third area, which is this sort of physical mounting of the motherboard. That's not been so good, I'm afraid. Now, if you think back to when I showed you the case, there was some little domed areas with a screw thread built into the middle, and that was to save you having to screw in a little motherboard mounting standoff. But this being an ATX case, they're in the locations for ATX motherboard fixing holes. Now, that was fine for these sort of 4 holes on this AT motherboard that line up, but there's one down here and one down here where you've got the little domed bit underneath but no mounting hole. So what that meant was the top of the domed bit was touching the back of the motherboard, and if I'd switched it on like that, that would have shorted out and risked damaging some of the components in the system. Now, if this was an ATX case where all the holes you just screw standoffs in the one you want, and you haven't got any of these silly little domed things, that wouldn't be an issue. And thankfully, that is the majority of this era of ATX cases. But for this particular kit that kind of sells itself as a just drop your AT motherboard in and connect it up and off you go, that's really not good. There's a big risk of component damage, as I say. So what I had to do was take this out to the workshop, and I've literally drilled out those domes, with a hole to the size of the dome, so it effectively removes it completely and just leaves a little hole there in the mounting tray. But it means there is no dome that can now short against the back of the motherboard. If you're buying something as a kit that's supposed to be ready to go, you shouldn't have to be doing those things. So yeah, a little bit disappointing that. There are also no other holes here that line up for AT motherboards, so what I've done is I've used those little black rubber sort of mounting blocks, and whilst I haven't put mounting screws in them, because the 4 holes that are there already hold the motherboard fine, I have put them underneath the sort of edges of the motherboard, just so that it takes all that flex out from sort of where the motherboard's sort of not really supported along its edge. You know, for when you plug in expansion cards in and or RAM in and whatnot. So yeah, quite like those little solid rubber blocks. They've worked quite nice for that. And one more thing on motherboard mounting, there's another kind of raised area just here for no apparent reason, and the corner of the motherboard, might be quite hard to see, but corner of the motherboard there is just touching that sort of pointless raised area. Now, there's no risk of shorting out there because there's no traces, you know, no electrical traces or components right on that very corner. But again, just for something as a kit that's a kit, you shouldn't be getting these things happening. And it's just, there's nothing special about this motherboard. It's just a standard sized baby AT board. So yeah, again, just like the domes that were touching the underside, it's just a little bit disappointing really. Right then, so that's going to bring us to the end of this video about installing AT system components into an ATX case. I appreciate this has been quite a sort of long and talkative video, but there are a lot of sort of variables and potential pitfalls when you do this kind of thing, and whilst not every single variable will apply to every situation, I've tried to cover as many of them as I can and hopefully give you some ideas about how to get around them, so that if you do try this project for yourself, you know, hopefully you'll find that of some use. So as for this case, you know, this kit that I decided to use for it, where it's supposed to be an ATX case all ready to go to drop your AT system in, can't say I'm particularly impressed with it, to be honest. I mean, start with the front. I know style is a very sort of, you know, it's a personal thing, but this is just not the right looks for an AT system for me. And yeah, I appreciate it's in a more modern case, but I do think we'll be coming back to this in a future video where we'll try and sort the looks of the front of the case out a bit. There are some good points to it. I mean, obviously it's nice and clean, no scratches or anything like that on it, with it being new old stock, so that's nice. And this toolless drive-based, toolless expansion card lock-in mechanism, that's quite nice for fiddling with those sorts of things often. But I mean, all that is outweighed by the fact that fundamentally it didn't do what it was supposed to do. You know, I had to modify it in order to fit the AT motherboard in, you know, stop those silly domed bits shorting out on the back of it. And you shouldn't be having to do that to something that advertises as being kind of, yeah, ready to go, just drop your motherboard in and jobs are good and sort of thing. So yeah, I just think it kind of fails a little bit on that level. It's certainly not ready to go. I mean, other than sort of 10 seconds to plug a power cable adapter in, it hasn't really ended up saving me any time over using pretty much any other ATX case. But anyway, yeah, that's where we're going to leave it for now. So I'll be back with more videos soon. I hope you've enjoyed watching this one. If you have, do the usual thing, please, you know, give us a thumbs up or drop a comment down below. But for now, I'm just going to say thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.